Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. My two sons had a remarkable high school history and language arts teacher, Dr. Perry. When introducing the topic of the Vietnam conflict, he instructed his students to go home that night and say to their parents, "Tomorrow we'll be learning about the Vietnam War. What should I know about this time in history?" The next day, the conversation in the classroom was robust and heated, but one student's comments were profound. "I asked my dad what I should know about the Vietnam War, and he started crying. For the first time in my life, I learned that he was a combat veteran in the war. I never knew this before. A national scar that does not appear to heal?" Let's discuss this with a poet who knows this topic well. Well, warm greetings, everybody. I'm looking forward to this podcast. We are interviewing a wonderful poet, writer, scholar, teacher, and I think vet. I'm not sure I've got those in the right order, Bill. Do I?
Oh, it doesn't really matter. I guess I'm a vet before I was any of those other things.
Well,
I was
is
in
it?
the Marines. I joined the Marines when I was 17. Uh, had to get my parents to sign the papers because I was underage. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Didn't quite work out the way I was expecting, but anyway, so I did the Marines first, then I went to college. Uh, And as far as my being a scholar, I guess I am, although I didn't get a PhD until I was 52 years old.
Well,
So I've been
Doctor
slow.
Ehrhart, that means something. So that's no small task. I came across you on one of my favorite podcasts, and also I subscribe to the magazine Current Affairs with Nathan. And you were just remarkable on this, talking about your service in the war, but also your poetry and your life. And I picked up your book, shared the book with Greg. We've had a couple of other poets on, and you have quite a remarkable story. Um, featured extensively in any article or documentary on the Vietnam War. You're going to just keep showing up and showing up. In fact, you were prominent on the Ken Burns documentary. Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, actually, I did I was part of that WGBH Vietnam a Television History that was aired back in 1983. And I really had a remarkable experience. The guy who made the segment that I was in, a man named Andrew Pearson, who had been a CBS cameraman in Vietnam for a number of years, he got a hold of me somehow. It's a long story, but I was very pleased with what Andrew did with my segment, um, and I thought that's the way these things worked. But there were then a couple of other documentaries done subsequent to that I was very unhappy with. And it turns out that documentary filmmakers, they have their own agendas and they do what they want to say. So after the second time I did one of these that I was very unhappy with, I did not do another documentary interview like that for 20 years.
Oh, goodness.
I just figured, screw, I can tell my own story, and I don't need to be a talking head for somebody else. Um, when it was actually Ken Burns, his co-producer, Lynn Novick, she did all the work. At this point, Ken is, he's the marquee name. He raises the money and stuff. But the actual work that I did was with Lynn Novick. She contacted me 6 years before this thing ever went on air. I was one of the first people they interviewed. And Lynn had taken the time to know who I am, read some of my work. I had somebody from the military channel want to interview me about something they were doing, and this woman didn't even know if I had been at Kaeshan or in the battle for Way City. She didn't know which of those I'd been in, and she wants to freaking interview me. And I told her, "Why don't you go do some homework, lady, and call me back?" Well, I never heard from her again, and I've had experiences like that with these jerk offs. Um, but Lynn had clearly read some of my work, knew who I was. That impressed me. I also have to admit that Ken Burns, I knew this was going to get wide attention, uh, no matter what. And I guess I figured I want to be part of this conversation. Um, I also was able to wrest a concession out of them that actually this Andrew Pearson from the WGBH thing said I'd never get them to agree to, but they did. And that was to give some of their money to the people we screwed, to the Vietnamese.
Oh, good.
And they actually agreed to do that. Um, but I told them I wouldn't do an interview unless they did that. And of course, Lynn's first reaction was, "Oh, we're not for profit. We're public health." Come on, Lynn,
Yeah.
you guys are going to be rolling in dough from this thing. So they did agree to do that, and I was very pleased. Um, I also knew that Ken Burns was not going to do a scathing expose of American imperialism. It just wasn't going to work that way. Bank of America was not going to underwrite that kind of a program. So I knew it was not going to be anything that I liked. It turned out that it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It was pretty bad in several significant ways. For one thing, if you saw the documentary, they left the best material I gave them on the cutting room floor.
And what was
They
what
didn't
was
put in.
what was that?
Oh, well, one was when a bunch of my buddies and I wrecked a Buddhist temple just because we were bored teenagers with guns and didn't have anything better to do. And so we destroyed this temple. And they didn't put that in. They actually did include a photograph of it in the book that goes along with it, but they didn't put it in the actual documentary. But that's because the American soldiers were portrayed in that documentary from start to finish as, poor victims. Oh, the sad things that happened to us, poor American boys. And in fact, in many instances, we were a bunch of armed juvenile delinquents. And a bunch of kids wrecking a temple for no reason on earth didn't fit the model of, the poor American soldier victims. So they didn't use that. And the other one they didn't use is uh, when I got back from Vietnam, I took my $2,021. Actually, I had $2,025, and I went down to West German Motors in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, and I bought a brand new Volkswagen. I'm back from Vietnam 24 hours. Only I didn't buy that car. I had to give the money to my father, and he bought that car, and the owner's card was in his name for another year and a half until I turned 21, which was the legal age in 1968. And not only that, but then the day after that, I'm back from Vietnam 48 hours. Um, I went to get insurance for my car, and I was told by our insurance agent that I had to be carried on my parents' policy as a dependent child. Think about that.
After being a
I'm a
Vietnam combat
combat
vet.
wounded Marine Corps sergeant.
Yeah, yeah.
But as far as the state of Pennsylvania is concerned, I'm just a child dependent on my parents. You want to talk spit on? That's being spit on. But it wasn't the people that popular mythology says were doing the spitting. It was my own government that was doing the spitting. I couldn't buy a beer in Pennsylvania until I turned 21. That was a year and a half later. And they didn't put that in. I begged them to put that in.
Wow.
And they didn't.
Well, they started the documentary. They started the documentary with quotes: "America involvement in Vietnam was begun in good faith by decent people out of faithful misunderstanding." At that point in time, I just started throwing things at the TV set.
That was outrageous. That was absolute. These guys were These guys were amoral power mongers who did not care about democracy or the Vietnamese. In fact, the original commitment in Vietnam was made with regard to the French and the political situation in Western Europe in 1945. Didn't have a damn thing to do with what was going on in Vietnam. The other thing is that the documentary handles the entire 3,000-year relationship of China and Vietnam in exactly one single sentence. Now, if you don't understand the relationship between Vietnam and China, you will never, ever understand why it was not possible for the United States to win the war in Vietnam.
Right.
Just, you couldn't understand it. Now, the things they did do that were sort of mitigating is they did a pretty good job of displaying the duplicity of both the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration. One of the problems for people like you and me is that we've been studying this war for the last 50 years. We know a hell of a lot that most people don't know. So I suspect that a lot of people heard things about the Vietnam War and about their government that they did not know previously. So they think, "Oh, wow, this is really something." But in fact, I mean, I knew it was going to be problematic. I just figured I want to be part of the conversation. And as it turns out, because I was on that program, I got some invitations to audiences that I otherwise would not have been invited to speak to. Um, and you know, if somebody made a documentary about the Vietnam War that I liked, I'd be showing it in my basement to me and my three best friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What did you, Bill? What did you think of the Oliver Stone trilogy on Vietnam? Of course, it was fictionalized.
It's Hollywood. It's just Hollywood bullshit. The only good movie Oliver Stone ever made was a movie called Salvador, and it was made back in the 80s, and it was a box office flop. And Oliver Stone decided, well, gee, I'd like to make a lot of money and be a cultural influence, so I'm going to start making crap. And that's what he did. And Platoon and Born on the 4th of July and all that stuff it's just Hollywood. It's entertainment. There's no truth in it. But as I told my students for years and years, I taught high school for 20 years. I used to tell the kids, if Hollywood were in the business of education, we'd all be out at the King of Prussia Mall eating popcorn and getting our high school diplomas.
Yeah.
Hollywood is in the business of entertainment. And as you guys probably know, if anybody ever made an honest movie about the Vietnam War, people would be throwing up and demanding their money back.
Right. Bill, you're a poet, and you also said you were a juvenile delinquent when you went to that Buddhist monastery and destroyed it. Would you mind reading a poem just for laughs? In your 1988 poem.
Sure.
I think it's page 137. I don't know if you have it or not.
Yeah, actually, I've got the book in front of me with all the poems you mentioned marked, so I can find them easily. The thing about this is I spent years trying to write about this incident. It really haunted me. But I didn't. I finally, after like 20 years, was able to write the poem because of a certain connection. Let me read the poem first, just for laughs. When I was 10, I thought that I would live forever. I could kill whatever I pleased. I was all that mattered. How else can one explain the firecrackers stuffed down throats of frogs and lit? Hop, hop, boom! A lot of laughs. Once we found a plump snake sunning itself beside the creek. Sluggish in the early morning chill, it only raised its head and turned two diamond black eyes to see four small boys with sticks. It didn't understand until we started beating on its flanks that we were dangerous and it was trapped. Our sticks were too light and we too timid to inflict anything but fury. So we started throwing stones. Small gashes ripped that snake's fat, thrashing sides, though it finally tired, but it couldn't run and wouldn't die. It only lay there heaving as the stones fell faster, till a miracle of birth, began so strangely even we were brought up short and stood there for a moment dumbly watching. Out of those gashes crawled a dozen baby water snakes, a dozen more small wriggling slivers of their mother's flesh. Some were bleeding, some had broken backs and dragged limp tails sideways through the dust. premature, even the ones uninjured that we carried home and put in jars all died. But it didn't matter. We had frogs and painted turtles, salamanders, and a praying mantis. Years later, I volunteered for war, still oblivious to what I'd done, or what I was about to do, or why. What finally made it possible to write that poem is the last three lines. Years later, I volunteered for war, still oblivious to what I'd done, or what I was about to do, or why. Because there's the connection. If any of us four little kids, we were like, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old, 10 years old, if any one of us would have encountered that snake one-on-one, we would have looked at it and gone, whoa, that's a big snake, and walked around it and left it alone. But because we were all there together, we had to prove to each other, we're not scared of this snake. Let's beat it up. And that is exactly the mentality of what we were doing in Vietnam. I was scared the whole time I was there, but I was less afraid of being injured or killed than I feared that my buddies would see just how frightened I was, just how chicken I really am. And so I did a whole lot of stuff that I wouldn't have done, except that I was afraid they'd realize I'm a chicken. Now, it turns out, I found out over the years subsequent to my getting home, that basically all the rest of the guys were doing the same damn thing. We do all this crazy shit because we're afraid that our buddies will realize that we're cowards. And then when I don't know how I made that connection, but the poem got written pretty quickly once I had those last few lines, because then I understood what we had done that day to that snake.
And
So,
I've been around a lot of vets. I'm an Air Force brat, and I have a lot of dear friends that were vets, and that brotherhood, that camaraderie, that love and regard for the person next to them that is overriding and prominent is a central theme of what it means to be a combat vet.
It wasn't even that sweet, that noble. It was, I didn't want my pals to realize I'm a coward.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. I didn't want to be called Yella.
Have you had a chance to talk to some younger people, people that are considering the military or considering that have
I have
that
been
kind of...
talking, Greg, I've been talking all my goddamn life. You haven't been able to shut me up since Kent State.
Yeah.
And
how they respond? I mean, that's clearly something that should move young people contemplating war. I know
some of them listen.
Yeah.
Some of them listen. Some of them don't. Most of them are trying to figure out if they're going to be able to feel little Susie's private parts on a date Saturday night. You know, moreover, my telling them one thing, and meanwhile they're watching NFL football with the flyovers and the salute to the military and the big American. You know, I'm just one voice in the midst of an ocean of militarism and phony patriotism. And you know, it's not like some kid's going to listen to me and suddenly go, wow, everything everybody's been telling me all my life is a lie. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
I taught when I was teaching high school, which I retired 3 years ago. I mean, one of the courses I taught was the U.S. and Vietnam. And we, in fact, spent a lot of time on the history of Vietnam and China. We studied the French colonial era. We didn't even get to the American War in Vietnam until 6 weeks into the course. They read Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam, the talk he gave at Riverside Church year before he was murdered. They read Colonel Robert Heinl's Collapse of the Armed Forces in Vietnam. I was giving them all sorts of stuff that they would never have encountered in almost any other arena. And still some of them. Now, none of the kids I taught in a private school. I am not certified to do what I did for 30 years. I have no piece of paper that says I'm qualified to teach. So I can't teach in the public schools. I was hired by actually an ex-Marine colonel or ex-Army colonel. And so I taught in a private school where you don't need to be certified and where I had a good deal more liberty. And not a single kid. I taught probably 1,600 kids in the time that I was there, beginning in 2001. Not a single one of the boys I taught did what I did. That is, I'm not going to college, at least not right away. I'm going to enlist in the military as a private. Not one of my students ever did that. Why not? Well, they had other options. Even if some of the kids who were on scholarship, even if their families didn't have much money, the mere fact that they got out of the Haverford School with a diploma from that school, every single kid went to college. They didn't all go to Stanford and the University of Chicago, but they all went to college. And of course, as you know, our military today is made up of, it's an economic draft.
Right.
Most of the people who join because they don't have many other options. I ran into a kid. Actually, I was speaking to a class at the University of Connecticut, and the kid was in the Army Reserve, and he had deployed to Afghanistan at one point, and he was only able to go to college because of the money he was getting from the Army, and yet he objected to my calling him an economic draftee. He said, "No, that's not why I went in." But you wouldn't be here in college if you know. It was amazing. The lies, the contradictions that people can live with are amazing. Now, I did have some students every year. One or two of the boys would go to one of the service academies where they get a free education and a guaranteed job when they graduate. But that's not the same as enlisting in the Marines as a private. That's not what my students did. So it didn't really matter much what I said to them because they didn't care. They'd got no skin in the game. Their parents don't care. Their kids aren't going to end up in body bags.
Right. Greg, what year were you born?
1947.
47. You're born in 48. I'm born in 51. So we've got a 4-year span between us. And I think that difference between the early, the brothers that the friends that I had who had older brothers that were vets and me, that 3 years is a remarkable, important time in history. And when I was a freshman when I was a junior in college, the Chicago Convention happened 100 miles north of me. And then Nixon started bombing Cambodia, and then Woodstock happened. Greg, you went to Woodstock, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I was working in Chicago during '68 when the convention occurred. I was working for M&M Mars Candy Company.
Right, right. And
I'd go home second shift and watch it on television.
Kent State, March on Washington, Pentagon Papers. These things all happened within a couple-year period, within a short period of time.
Everything shifted. When I got out of high school in 1966, in the little town where I grew up, there was nothing resembling a hippie, no anti-war movement. Nobody was smoking marijuana. I would have known it because I was with the crowd who did all that crazy shit. We were drinking every weekend, but marijuana was none of that stuff existed in 1966. By 1969, when I got out of the Marines, my buddies that I'd gone to school with were smoking dope. They were looking like, long-haired, freaky guys. I had several classmates who asked me to write CO recommendations for them, which I did. So you're right. Everything shifted. I mean, in 1966, the idea that my government would lie to me was not even a possibility. By 1969, young people are thinking differently, and by 1971, the whole ball game had changed. So, yeah, you're right. It was a time of enormous change. One of the things to remember is that people like George Bush and Dick Cheney and what's the Stockman guy who was Reagan's budget
David
dude, and
Stockman.
you know, the guy who was president of the World Bank, Robert Zellick, and you know, all these guys were also our generation, and they must have spent decades grinding their teeth with hatred at us lefties. And of course, when they got into power, they were able to stick it to us. You know, these are the guys who sent off a whole generation to Afghanistan and Iraq. So it wasn't like our whole generation was tuned in, because it wasn't. But there was a lot of change that went on during those years.
Kind of remarkable. In by 72, you know, 73 with Nixon's impeachment, Nixon going out, it looked like a whole new world was dawning. I mean, it really looked like the Vietnam War was winding down, and Nixon was going to be gone, and we'd never revisit that kind of era again. But by the time Reagan got in, we were back in the saddle.
Well, the wrong people learned the wrong lessons from the war. I've often heard people say we didn't learn anything, but actually, some very dangerous people learned a great deal. And one of the things that the people in Washington learned is that the American people don't care what you do with their tax money, as long as it's not their children coming home dead. By the time that the power structure learned that lesson, the Vietnam War there was no way you were going to reinvent that one. But look at how Reagan fought the wars in Central America. It was all with American money, and there were thousands and thousands of poor peasants in Central America, in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras that died. But Americans didn't give a rat's ass, because it was only our tax money that was being used for that stuff. And when you look at now this all-volunteer military, which I think is the greatest disaster of the Vietnam War, what has happened with the so-called volunteer military is that the consequences of American foreign policy have been completely removed from American domestic politics. American people don't care.
Right.
It's only a tiny group of people who are in the military, and most of those people come from that segment of society which has the least voice in the political system, the lowest economic rungs. So they learned how to wage war without an anti-war movement. Look at that, 20 years in Afghanistan, and where's an anti-war movement? It didn't exist. Right. Why should it? Because the kids and the parents of the kids that I taught weren't ever going to have to spend a day in uniform, let alone go to some bumfuck place and get killed.
Right.
So people learn things from the Vietnam War. It's just the wrong people learned the wrong things.
And at the time, the information was distorted. In 1968, I lived in Rantoul, Illinois, and an older brother, a friend of mine, went to the Chicago conventions. He was a photographer, and back then, you know, you had to go into the dark room, and you didn't have color photos. You had black and white. And he came back from the convention with his face just totally pulverized, and his camera was broken by the police, but he was able to smuggle out a few rolls, maybe 3 or 4 rolls of film that they didn't destroy. And we went into the dark room, and I remember images after image after image coming up of this guy showing what was going on. There was a police absolutely out of control. And when you read the paper, when you read the account of that situation, they were all pro-police. They were all get the hippies out of there. There was no mass support for the Vietnam protest that was occurring at that time. No. It's the opposite. No. Kent State, same thing. I was at the Dewey Canyon 3 in the 1971 protest. And for those of you people who don't know the Dewey Canyon 3, it was where all of the vets, was that the Veterans Against the War? Were you involved with that?
Eventually I got very active with VVAW, although at the time, you know, I was still putting things together. After Kent State, I realized this war is terrible. It's something terribly's gone wrong here. But for 15 months, I believed we really did mean well. We tried to do the right thing. Something went wrong. It was only when I started reading the Pentagon Papers in June of 1971 that I realized this was no mistake. The only mistake was that we took on a bunch of people who were tougher than we were. But it was the Pentagon Papers that opened my eyes to the reality. In April, when Dewey Canyon took place, I actually was invited to go down there, and I was not yet politically ready to do that. But then when I saw the vets throwing their medals over the fence, I wished I had gone. So the next week, I went down for the May Day demonstrations, which were a much larger group of mostly, what was it called, New Mob or something like that. And I went down the next week and got caught in the middle of a police riot in front of the Justice Department and almost got my brains beaten out. And boy, I mean, Jesus Christ, talk about learning reality. But in any case, I didn't put the whole thing together until June of 71. Though I'm sort of like, most people wish they had gone to Woodstock. I wish I'd gone to Dewey Canyon 3. It bothers me that I wasn't part of that.
I was there, and there were maybe 700 vets. For people that don't know, they had partitioned off the Capitol, and there was a statue. I think it was Madison or somebody. There was a statue, and the vets had a microphone set up, and they would give a short speech. They'd introduce themselves and who they were, and then they would take their medals and they would throw their medal on top of this statue. And sometimes vets who parents of kids that were killed would do it for one of the parents, and not one person that was not a vet spoke. It was all vets, and it went on for an hour and a half. It was
now, the original plan,
extraordinarily powerful.
The original plan was for the vets to go into Congress and give the medals to their Congress people, their own representatives. But when the government found out this was going to happen, they put up overnight that cyclone fence to keep the veterans out of their own Congress.
Oh.
And so what they ended up doing was to create this incredible, visual image of all these vets throwing their medals over that fence. It actually got much more media coverage because they wouldn't let the vets do what they'd planned to do.
Right.
So I got a buddy of mine who tossed away a silver star. There's a new book. Well, it's not quite new. McFarland, who did the collected poems you have just reissued my memoir. It's called Passing Time, a memoir of a Vietnam veteran against the war. And it really deals with the 5 years after I got home, trying to make sense of what happened to me. They've just brought out a revised and updated edition of the book this month. But I got a photograph of this dear friend of mine, Ron Farisi, tossing away a silver star. And it's a very dramatic photograph. It's just his face is all twisted with emotion, and he's hurling this thing over the fence. It was a very powerful, I think it might have been the most powerful anti-war activity of the entire Vietnam War. This is another thing. Nowadays the popular culture has that we were all spit on and called baby killer and crap like that. But what the American people were seeing in 70, 71, 72 was that veterans themselves protesting the war they'd fought. That's what was showing up on the news. It wasn't people, anti-war people assaulting poor veterans. It was the veterans themselves out there protesting the war. You go back and look at the media. That's what they see, and that's been completely pushed out of the historical record and replaced by this bogus bullshit about poor veterans being spit on. And if somebody would have spit on me when I got back from Vietnam, I'd have ripped their fucking throat right out of their head. You're going to tell me that thousands of veterans were abused like that and nobody punched anybody out? Are you kidding me? That's bullshit. Anyway,
I have another poem I want you to read. Another. It's the last time I dreamed about the war. And let's and you. I see you have a book on that too. That was titled that.
Yeah, the book is actually a collection of essays about me and my writing and my teaching. It's pretty cool, actually. It was put together by a Breton Frenchman who organized the whole thing. I had no real part in it except for an interview he did with me. But he chose that as the title of the collection. The guy's name is Jean-Jacques Malot. The book was also published by McFarland. And usually you have to be a famous person for somebody to write a book about you. So this was pretty cool. But I said I was just along for the ride. JJ did all the work. I don't know why. I mean, I'm sure he's made enough money off that book to take himself out to dinner once or twice, but he likes my stuff. Anyway, the poem, Last Time I Dreamed About the War. Because listeners are hearing it cold turkey, I need to tell you there's a woman in the poem named Ruth. And about halfway through the poem, I start talking about the woman sleeping next to me, who is not Ruth. I'm actually having a dream about a woman I had dated previously. So that's the shift that takes place. Last time I dreamed about the war. Ruth and I were sitting in the kitchen 10 years after Vietnam. She was 6'2" and carried every inch of it with style. Didn't care a fig that I was 7 inches shorter. You've got 7 inches where it counts. She'd laugh, then lift her chin and smile as if the sun had just come out. But she didn't want to hear about the war. I heard the sound of breaking glass coming from my bedroom, went to look. VC rats were jumping through the window. They looked like rats, but they were Viet Cong. Don't ask me how I knew. You don't forget what tried to kill you. I tried to tell her, but she wouldn't listen. Now look, Ruth, I said so loud the woman sleeping next to me woke up and did what Ruthie in my dream refused to do. She listened to me call the name of someone she had never heard of, anger in my voice, my body hard. The woman I was sleeping with would be my wife, but wasn't yet. I was still a stranger with a stranger's secrets and a tattoo on my arm. She'd never known a man who'd fought in Vietnam, put naked women on the wall, smoked marijuana, drank whiskey straight. And here I was in bed with her, calling someone else's name in anger. She wanted to run, she told me later, but she didn't. She married me instead. Don't ask me why. I only know you never know what's going to save you. And I've never dreamed again about the war. Now, that was March of 1980. And I'm still married to that woman 42 years later, coming up on 43 years. And I have never had a nightmare about the war in Vietnam since then.
Bill, tell me about the power of relationships and wives and in healing the vets. In the cases that I know of my dear friends who struggle with PTSD and have had a lot of difficulty adjusting following Vietnam, it was the women in their lives that were the power that helped them. Is it that the case with you, both your wife and your daughter?
Not really. It was, when I first met Anne, my wife, it took her a year and a half before she'd even go out with me. I asked her out repeatedly, and then I went away for a while, and because I got tired of asking, and it's a long story, but eventually she decided she'd give me a tryout. And when we became close, she told me that when she first met me, we had been teaching at the same little boarding school. She really was interested in me, which I kept picking up on, but that I frightened her. She didn't think she could handle me. I was the most intense person she'd ever met. And that was 11 and a half years after I left Vietnam. I was a hot wire for a long, long time, and I stayed that way for a long time. I don't know why my wife stuck with me for the first 20 years of our marriage, because it has taken me a lifetime to learn how to be a decent human being. I was never physically abusive, but I was a handful, and I had a lot of problems with my temper. But here's the thing, the Vietnam War pushed all my buttons, but the buttons had been installed before I ever got there. I didn't get PTSD in Vietnam. I got it in the household I grew up in, because my brothers, who don't have my experiences with the military, are exactly like me emotionally. We grew up in a very dysfunctional family, and we're all fucking crazy. And it took me years and years to finally figure out how to be a half decent person. So, and Ann's role in that was to not leave me for the first 20 years of our marriage. But it's not like she's the one who did this. Her love has been absolute. I hit the jackpot.
Right.
I spent the first half of our marriage, I mostly was writing all those books that nobody reads while she was working and supporting the family with the mortgage and the health care and all that stuff. I mean, I had it. If you ever hear me talk about the hard life of a writer, give me a smack. Because Anne has made it possible for me to do what I've done with my adult life. But trying to figure out how to cope with who I am has been largely my own doing, and it took a longer than it should have. I stopped doing drugs in my early 50s. I stopped drinking almost 8 years ago. Those were all things I needed to do. I mean, as I said, the war didn't do me any good, but I can't blame who I am on the Vietnam War. And I have a feeling that for a lot of people, that's an easy excuse. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. It's,
I'm sure you remember the I.F. Stone quote, "All governments lie." And I think the more
all governments are made up of liars, and anything they say should not be believed. You want to know something? That quote was hanging in my classroom for 2 decades at the Haverford School.
Well, speaking of your classroom, Greg has been trying to get me to read a couple of biographies of Smedley Butler. That's one of his.
Oh yeah, especially there's a new one that's just out.
I know.
Came out about a year ago.
We need to interview the author. I've got it on my shelf here, and I just haven't read it yet. Now we don't do any interviews with anybody unless we read the books. That's one of our golden rules. So tell me about Smedley Butler, Greg's.
Well, Butler.
Greg's
it turns out, I learned at Paris Island in the summer of '66. We had to know the names of the 2 Marines who won Medals of Honor twice and lived to tell about it. One of them was Dan Daly, and the other was Smedley Butler. But I didn't discover the real story of Smedley Butler until the Reagan Wars in Central America. And then he got resurrected. There's that amazing, his essay, War is a Racket, where he talks about how he'd been a gangster for capitalism and a muscle man for Wall Street. And it's an amazing quote. So I learned about him, his whole story, in the 1980s. But it turns out that he is a graduate of the Haverford School for Boys, where I taught for 20 years. So I resurrected Smedley's memory. He had been, he came out against all this crap, what today we'd call the military-industrial complex, but this was in the 1930s, when he started bad-mouthing American military adventurism and stuff. He was written out of the history of the school where I taught. He was perceived as a guy who had betrayed his class, his people, rich Republicans. And when I got there, years and years later, like 65 years later, um, there was a guy who was doing research, a 1969 graduate of the school, and he stumbled upon Smedley Butler, and he wrote to the headmaster, who is the guy who had hired me, and said, "How could I go to the Haverford School for 13 years and never have heard about Smedley Butler?" Well, Joe said, "You should talk to Bill Ehrhart. He's a big Smedley Butler fan." I'd had a poster of Butler hanging in my classroom since the first day I started teaching there with that, I was a gangster for capitalism speech. Um, so with Fred's money and Joe, the headmaster's support, uh, we resurrected Smedley Butler's place on the Haverford School campus. Uh, the classroom I used for my last 6 years was the Smedley Butler classroom, which Fred,
God.
I think he gave him $50,000, and they put a plaque up that said the Smedley Butler classroom. There is an oil painting of Butler done by a student hanging outside the upper school admissions office. There's a bench on campus that circles a tree that is the Butler bench and has 6 brass plates that describe his life, which I wrote the text for. Um, so we introduced Smedley Butler to the school that had forgotten about him because they thought he was a traitor. So I feel good about that. And I taught a course.
Shouldn't. Yeah.
For 3 years, I created a course called Smedley Butler and the Rise of American Imperialism. Um, and that was a lot of fun. So now, unfortunately, since I've moved on, the history elective courses, the history teachers teach their own little hobby horses. So nobody's teaching my Vietnam course and nobody's teaching my Smedley Butler course. But for a few years at least, that stuff was going on. And Butler is an interesting character. He was writing letters to his father, who was a congressman, as a young lieutenant from uh, Central America, saying, "This is bullshit. This is crap. All we're doing down here is making, we're defending the rich gringos against these poor peasants who got nothing." And he's writing this stuff to his father, saying, "Why are we doing this crap?" Um, but he continued to do it for 34 years. Why? Because he loved to fight. He loved the adrenaline charge of combat. He just
Hmm.
plain was having fun.
Any
So
thoughts
there's this.
on Major General Smedley Butler, Greg?
Well, he was, yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure Bill taught this too, but he was approached by the Liberty League in the 30s
Oh yes.
who wanted to, well, I'll let you tell the story, Bill, but it's a great story. It's apocryphal. It's not apocryphal, but a lot of people don't believe it or buy it, but I do. You want to tell that
Oh,
story?
it very much happened in when Butler had retired in I think 1931. Um, a bunch of very rich people, the J.P. Morgan guys and the DuPont brothers, um, these rich industrialists were convinced that Franklin Roosevelt was a commie bastard who was going to ruin their lives and ruin America. And they got together in 1934 and tried to organize what would have been a coup d'état. And they really wanted to get Douglas MacArthur to head this thing. They were going to use the membership of the American Legion as their shock troops. Um, but but basically they realized, MacArthur's soldiers hated him. He was a miserable son of a bitch who didn't care about his troops or anybody but himself. Um, so they decided they would ask Butler because they knew that Butler was widely respected by the ordinary soldiers. What they missed was that Butler also loved the American Constitution. And so he kept his mouth shut and collected enough information to figure out what was going on. And then he turned this over to Congress. And they had hearings. They never called the big shots. The DuPonts never got called to testify. Morgan never got called to testify. Um, but Roosevelt apparently pulled those guys aside and said, "I know what you're up to, and if you don't drop this, I'm going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. I'll ruin you." So they went away. But here's the interesting thing: that committee, one of the members of that committee in 1935 was Tip O'Neill,
Huh.
who was the Speaker of the House in the 1960s. I think into the early 70s. He was there forever. And before he died, after he retired from Congress, but before he died, he admitted that everything Butler had told that committee was true. Everything about the DuPonts and all the guys who were behind this thing, it was all true. But, Butler said, now what would have happened if he had gone along with it? I don't know, but he saved America from what amounted to a coup d'état.
It's interesting you brought up Douglas MacArthur, because of course he was the guy that attacked the bonus marchers in 1931. Hoover unleashed him, and I just read.
Who were soldiers that, they were soldiers that MacArthur had commanded in the First World War.
It was funny because I just read a book review that this book claims that he was told by Hoover to just surround that plaza. That was that flats, where the soldiers were encamped, 30,000 of them. And he was told to just surround it, but he said, "I never got the order," and he attacked them. And Eisenhower's with him, and so was Patton in that whole thing.
Well, not only did he claim he never got the order, Eisenhower had the order in his hand, and he tried to give it to MacArthur. And MacArthur said, "I don't have time for writing." And Eisenhower admitted to that one. Yeah, Eisenhower and Patton were both majors at the time. Eisenhower was his chief of staff, and Patton was in charge of the tanks and cavalry that went over the bridge that Hoover had told him not to cross. But when Roosevelt heard about that, Roosevelt supposedly his first response was, "I'll be the next president."
Yeah.
It's too bad you aren't still teaching. You could have Greg stop in as a guest lecturer in your Smedley Butler unit.
Well, I miss mixing it up with the boys. I had a great deal of fun doing that. But I don't miss grading compositions, and I don't miss faculty meetings, and I haven't had hard shoes on or a tie since June of 2019. There's a lot of stuff I don't miss about the teaching. It was time. It was just time. I had a wonderful time there. I got away with stuff that probably most of the teachers at that school couldn't have gotten away with, let alone at any other school.
Yeah.
But
Bill, I do an introduction to these podcasts, and my introduction was a story about a high school teacher that was a remarkable teacher. Reminds me of you. And he would start his lecture. He would start his unit on Vietnam by saying, "Tomorrow we're starting to learn about Vietnam. I want you to go home and ask your parents, what should I know about Vietnam?" And of course, when the kids come back the next day, the comments are just, they're arguing, and those in favor of, we should have bombed them, or this was horrible. Their parents are, adamant in feeding these kids, "I want to tell you this story." And one 17-year-old high school girl said, "I asked my dad, what should I know about Vietnam?" And he started to cry. And he started to cry because he had never disclosed to her before that he was in Vietnam. He was a combat vet.
Wow.
And just the fact that she would ask him that, meant so much to him. And I think that's one of the things I get with your poetry is that it's the power of how this event shapes lives, not just the lives of you, the lives of me, the lives of this 17-year-old girl, the lives of other, friends that have struggled with this. And it's a powerful story, and you tell it so well. You tell it so well.
Well, thank you. The one thing I've come to terms with it. I've accepted it, but in that book that you've got, my collected poems, there are 308 poems in that book, and barely a quarter of them deal with war in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
There's a whole lot more to my life than the 13 months I spent in Vietnam. But it is also true that I have spent a great part of my life trying to come to terms with those 13 months.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
I also realize that being recognized as a Vietnam War poet is better than not being recognized at all, which is the fate of most writers like me.
Right.
Nobody's ever heard
What
of
is
you.
Bill, what's your thinking about what's going on today? I mean, what is your, all of us, nobody's immune to what's going on in the news today, the war in Ukraine, U.S. foreign policy, drone warfare. What are your views on how do you see things today? Have you learned anything?
How much time have we got?
Yeah.
I don't know how to. If you go to a website called LA Progressive, you will find a whole series of short essays that I have written and published on that website that pretty much over the years since Dolt 45 ran for president originally will trace how I feel about this stuff. I think that the smartest thing Joe Biden ever did was to get the hell out of Afghanistan. I know he took a lot of grief about the disaster that followed, but look at the disaster that followed when we left Vietnam. There's no clean way to get out of a situation like that. There just isn't. And we could have stayed there till hell froze over, and the same chaos would have happened. And meanwhile, I think it was a very smart decision to get the hell out of there. I am disappointed that he is willing to use so many drone missiles in other situations. I was heartbroken when the war in Ukraine started. I don't know quite. I actually wrote a very depressing poem about that when back in February when it started. But the way I've dealt with that is that on a monthly basis, I make regular contributions to the Ukrainian Catholic Church here in Philadelphia, and they have promised that that money will go entirely to civilian relief in Ukraine. And that's what I'm doing. Whether we should be giving them weapons or attacking Russia or what, I'm out of it anymore. I what did we think was going to happen pushing NATO right up to the borders of Russia? What do you think the Russians were going to do if we bring in all these Warsaw Pact nations into NATO? What the hell would the U.S. do if Russia signed military alliances with Mexico and Canada? You think we'd just sit back and go, "Oh well, there you go"? Certainly, you could. Now, I have nothing good to say about Vladimir Putin, but that doesn't make rubbing the Russians' noses in the fact that they lost the Cold War a good idea. Right. So I've been waiting for this to happen for the last 25 years, ever since stupid Clinton started bringing in all these Warsaw Pact countries. What did you expect was going to happen?
Right.
So, although the Russians certainly have nothing good to say about the Russians, the United States and its foreign policy helped to create this situation. So the only thing I can do is try to give a little bit of relief to the poor bastards who are suffering from the war. That's it. That's what I do. Every month. Send them money.
Right.
And the rest of it, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly glad that Adult 45 took a beating in the midterms. But, well, it's very difficult to feel good about much of anything these days. I am glad that in Pennsylvania, we actually elected a half-decent governor and a half-decent senator. And in local elections, this Pennsylvania State House, the lower house in Harrisburg, actually flipped over to the Democratic control for the first time in 12 years. So I guess that's nice because, But how do I feel now? I don't know. I mean, the thing is that a lot of this is stuff you want to cut out of the interview. I mean, my prognosis for the future is pretty bad because I think no matter what happens domestically, no matter what happens with foreign policy, once global warming really takes hold, we're all fucked. And I do not see the human race changing its behavior completely enough or fast enough to stave off the disaster that we have already put in motion. So I think that, that's the big picture. And I keep reminding myself that the universe is a big damn place, and it's been here for a long time, and it really doesn't care about tiny little planet Earth, let alone about Bill Ehrhart.
Yeah, if you're right about that. Just the new well, Biden just got back from overseas. Not one mention of fossil fuel limitation. Not one.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So
it's so frustrating.
So that's what I feel about today. I still write my stupid little op-ed pieces, though I don't think it's going to change anything, but it keeps my head from exploding. I still write poems now and then sometimes about political things, sometimes not. But basically I'm 74 years old, and I find myself not all that eager to stick around much longer. I don't feel good about the way all this is going to end up. I do think that American democracy, such as it is, has preserved itself for at least another 2 years. I thought that Republicans were going to take charge of Congress and set things up so that Trump or DeSantis, who's even scarier, would win in 2024, and that would be the end of a two-party system, and we would have an openly fascist state. It looks like that we've staved that one off for at least 2 more years. So,
right.
Well, you got to stick around, Bill. You got to stick around.
You got to keep
writing.
Well,
we'll see.
There's too few people that are advocating for change and advocating for justice and sense, good sense. So we need everybody. We need absolutely.
Well, and every
everybody.
time I get a little discouraged, I just had a long conversation the other last night with Dan Ellsberg, and this is a guy who's like 91 years old, and he's still out there doing this stuff. And I just think, well, Jesus, if he can find the energy to do it, I certainly can't quit yet.
Right.
Right.
Because he's
Well, I'm going to link.
91.
I'm going to link to your articles in the LA Progressive that June 2014 to November, just so people will understand that you're a lot more than just Vietnam poems. You have a lot more to say, and you're a powerful critic of our involvement in foreign policies that are misguided, that we don't seem to shed light on, but you shed light on them. And geez, Bill, I've got like 5 more poems. I want to just keep chatting with you, but maybe we'll just kind of do this again sometime.
Well, I'm not, as far as I know, I'm not going anywhere. I suppose. Yeah. So what the hell time is it anyway? We've been on for like an hour.
All right.
So I guess it is time to cut this off, but
how about this
one? We can do this again, and whenever.
Let's do it again. Yeah, why don't you? The name of your book is "Thank You for Your Service," and one thing that just bothers me when Veterans Day comes is all the kind of false grace that people bestow on these. They see the Vietnam hat, "Thank you for your service," and it's just it's so shallow. It's so. I know the intentions are good. I know that people are really trying to make a connection with a other human being, but it misses for me, and I think it misses for you too, doesn't it?
Oh, it drives me crazy when people say that to me. And this, interestingly enough, I wrote this poem. This was the last poem I wrote before I sent the manuscript off to the publisher. And it's the perfect poem to end the book with and to lend its title to the book. I love it. It's called "Thank You for Your Service." Yes, of course. It's what you say these days. Like genuflecting in a Catholic church. Like saying "bless you" to a sneeze. A superstitious reflex, but of course sincere. Or is it just to ease the guilt of sending someone else to do your dirty work? Whatever. I just say, you're welcome. Let it go at that. When what I'd really like to say is, thank you for my fucking service in that fucking war I've dragged from day to day for 50 fucking years like a fucking corpse that won't stay dead. That fucking nightmare that my fucking country told me was my fucking patriotic duty to fight. For what exactly do you think you're thanking me? Service to my country? You empty-headed idiot. You think I want your thanks for what I did? You shallow, superficial twit. You've no idea what I did, or why, or what it cost a people who had never done us any harm, nor ever would or could. You can take your thank you for my service, shove it where the sun doesn't shine. But you wouldn't understand. You'd only get insulted if I told you what I'd really like to say. So I just say, you're welcome, smile, walk away.
Well, at the end of performances, they drop the mic. I think we can drop the pin on that one. That's which I figuratively and literally just did.
Yeah, well,
Bill, you're
okay.
just I don't know, but I've been looking forward to this so much. I think that if people have got to pick up your collection, your book, Thank You for Your Service, which is a whole series of poems. And like you said, you know, a quarter of them are war poems. It's about a young man and sexuality and daughters and family and your mother-in-law, and it's about so much more. And it just shows you that you know, the foundation of your basic being is a good person. And I know you've struggled to say to get there, but boy, you're there now. So that's my
thank you
that's
very
my 2
much.
cents.
Great
And if you
pleasure. Great, Bill.
do
Great
your
pleasure.
listeners give you any feedback?
Oh yeah.
I mean, if people want to hear more, if you hear from folks that they'd like to hear more of this, we can do this again in a few months or something.
Oh, I'd love to. You're
Great.
yeah. Maybe get you with other poets or something. I don't know. Maybe we send you the Smedley book, and if we can't get the author, you could chat a little bit about that. That'd be fun to tie in a lot of your teaching and history and how powerful that is in shaping war protests.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for accommodating my technophobia.
Oh, you're just fine. And thank you for, I had to write back and forth, and then you finally said, okay, you're persistent. I'll do your goddamn podcast. And I'm so glad you did. So this was wonderful. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your poems.
Greg and Pat, good to talk with you.
Bye now.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye-bye.